Hello, I'm Katja Viguk and welcome to the Walk the Valley, the podcast that breaks down barriers to bringing healthcare innovation to market. Today we're talking about something that's rarely discussed openly. What happens when a startup fails? What can we learn from it? And how do you navigate the fallout while preparing for your next chapter? My guest today is Tomas de Souza, former CEO of Ablemind, a mental health tech startup, and new CEO of Mink, the incubator in Malmö. Tomas, could you say a few words about yourself?
Yeah, you already said a few words, but going back a bit further, I identify as entrepreneur. I've been starting and running about 5 companies, and I've also been working as an executive in larger organizations, always with digitization and transformation as first priority. And this last year I've been digging deep into human intelligence as next to artificial intelligence. What will happen with humans next to this brand new thing or tool that we are seeing developing in front of our eyes?
So you're looking into how AI is influencing the human behavior or jobs?
Yeah, everything that has to do with the collaboration between humans and AI, both like the risks coming from it, but even more so, how can we as humans benefit more from this new intelligence? Like how could we evolve and how could we focus more on typical human skills?
Well, it's super interesting, and how fast you have come back to business and found your next mission. Because you were a CEO of Ablemind that has recently filed for bankruptcy. And Ablemind was also based on machine learning algorithms, mostly analyzing human behavior for mental health purposes, right?
Yes, so the short pitch was that we were using AI to better understand patients and their symptoms and experiences. And based on these descriptions from the patient, we could actually define type and severity of some of the most common mental health disorders.
At what point did you realize that the situation might not be recoverable with Ablemind?
Yeah, there was actually no such point. I think from my perspective, I was the CEO, appointed external CEO of the company, and we had our ups and downs through the years, of course, as any startup. And I'd been with the company for 4 years, and we had realized that the founders behind the company, they had a conflict that couldn't really be resolved. So we were working to find a way to continue to run the company, but with a new suit, so to speak, that could benefit both the current investors, bring in new investors, but also sort of get rid of this conflict and the things that weren't really aligning with the company's interest.
But in retrospect, this reshuffling and restructuring didn't quite work out. How did you deal with the emotions and your leadership responsibilities in those stages?
It's interesting you ask for emotions, because it is, of course, a very emotional period in time. I think for anyone who is related to a company in this stage, everything from investors to co-workers, customers perhaps, and of course founders. So there were a lot of emotions to deal with, my own of course, but also the people around me, the stakeholders. So from what I remember, I tried to put my own emotions on pause for the while and quite quickly formed a plan for myself. What am I supposed to do in this situation, and how can I sort of continue to steer this ship towards a good harbor, so to speak. So the point in time where I got to know that we were in this situation was actually when it was too late. So I was informed that the company filed for bankruptcy. The founders did that, and I didn't know, and I had been working for a plan to save it. So that was like the first emotion was, of course, anger and frustration in that situation. But it kind of quickly turned into how can I be constructive in this situation. But that was also the same for what happened before that. There was a struggle going on, and of course this conflict going on, and the emotions didn't really help. So the more constructive I could be and the more of a plan I could come up with, the easier it became for me, and I think for the team as well.
It's such a tough situation because you weren't part of the founding team. You were hired as the CEO to lead Ablemind, right?
Yeah, I came in as one of the first external employees in the company.
So you had quite a lot of stakeholder management to deal with. How do you manage investors when things aren't going as planned?
I think, investors aren't really for managing, so I'm not sure about the choice of words there, but I think relationships with stakeholders, they start much earlier than a crisis, of course. So that's something you build over time. So a lot of the principles and values that we had in these relationships were the same during a period of crisis. So we tried to be very transparent and active in communication, sharing the information we had at hand, and be really clear on what was going on and why. The kind of information that came out was, of course, a lot of ups and downs, as it were for the company, but at least they had the same information as we had and could therefore make decisions on their own behalfs. And I think that's a truly important principle to stick with, like not trying to hide things away, to try to make it work yourself, but actually share the situation. Maybe someone can step in and help in a way that you hadn't really figured out yourself. So to be clear on what's going on, communicate efficiently and clearly, and also be very open to whatever happens next.
This actually resonates with the studies, entrepreneurship studies, that show that transparent communication is very important in success or in successfully navigating different situations with the team.
Yeah, but it's so much easier to be transparent when things are going well. So I think I also, for me, I had to learn the hard way the difference between being actually transparent when things are not going well and the difference it makes to share the situation openly as compared to keeping it within, both from mental health perspective for myself, but also what I said before, people can help. And the load that you share with others is much easier to carry as well. So both from a practical perspective, but also psychological perspective, it's easier to be a few people working together in crisis than to try to keep it to yourself.
I see. You've mentioned a blind spot that you encountered in this process when you found out retrospectively that the founders have filed for bankruptcy. What kind of blind spots did you encounter in decision making at Ablemind?
Yeah, I think the earliest blind spots I experienced with this company, I have a background in media. Of course, I've been working with digitization over many years, but I haven't been in healthcare. And our customers were healthcare providers. And I would never have guessed before how hard it would be to build trust in that target group or customer group. Since I didn't have the medical background and the training that they had, it was hard for them to accept that I came with knowledge in their field. We had some solutions for that later on, but it took me a while to figure that out. And I think some industries are harder in this aspect than others. This long, strict training that a doctor or a psychologist or a lawyer goes through makes it harder both for them to accept other kinds of knowledge in their space, but also for the rest of us to fully understand what it means to be in their shoes.
It's super interesting that you mentioned building trust in healthcare stakeholders. How did you manage to do that?
Yeah, the easiest and best benefit I had was my close colleague who was a psychologist. So we sold together. It could have been more efficient if we could have sold separately and meeting with different customers, but we had to do it together. That worked better for us than if I would have fronted this myself.
Okay, I see. So you had to bring an expert from the team with you.
Yeah, and I mean she was one of the founders, so it was not an issue to bring someone in. She was out selling the company as well. It rather had to do with like how we were fronting and proposing these solutions to the market.
Do you have any tips to startup leaders to minimize blind spots and get more realistic view of their situation?
I think the first thing to just come to terms with is that there's so much you don't know. And just start there. From what I've seen and also my own experiences, it's very easy to start with what you have access to, like starting to build a product, coming up with a concept or idea, because that's something that you can do on your own, and you can come quite far, even more far now when we have AI coders and such. So really what needs to be done at an early stage is to create a really solid understanding of what the market looks like, what kind of conditions will we be operating in. So understanding that there will be blind spots everywhere, some of them more important than others. And if you have that mindset from the beginning, I think you will be more prone to asking questions and seeking information, and therefore not being tricked by your blind spots as easily as you could otherwise.
Yeah, it resonates with our previous episode, or one of our previous episodes, where Will and I sat down and we're talking about testing your assumptions in order to figure out whether what you think would benefit your users or create value for your users would actually do that.
Yeah, I think, that's the whole job at an early stage. It's easy to think that it is to build an MVP or build a product, but there's so much work happening before that MVP should be created. But it's often harder for us to do than to take the first steps on product or offering or a slide deck.
Statistically speaking, most startups fail. How do you think founders can better prepare for when things fall apart, or if things fall apart?
I don't think that you should prepare for that, actually, even if the realistic view of how things will turn out is that it's probably going to fail. If we were realistic, we wouldn't do it. Like if the 90% is correct of failure, then why would you even start? So I think spending time and planning for what happens when we fail is not something you should do. I think failure is never an option, it's always an outcome. So the thing you should plan for is what you said before, like when hardship arrives, because it will for sure, to realize early what kind of hardship do we expect to come and what do we do when that arrives. And I think to have some work done, if you're a founding team, for example, to have some work done early on when you discuss values and vision and everything that goes into a company and the purpose behind it, but also discuss principles. Like if you are two founders and you start a company, everything is great, like when you move in together with a new partner. But the best way to keep it great is to write down the principles for what happens when it's not great in a company. If someone loses interest in this company and steps out and doesn't want to work with it anymore, what happens to our ownership, for example? And these principles, we had one, for example, in Ablemind. We agreed on the board that bankruptcy was the final straw. We were to do everything we could to not end up there. And to have such a principle and be able to rely on the board to stick to that is so important, especially in a time of crisis, that you do a lot of hard work and it's taking toll of your health, but you do it because you were a team that agreed to do it. So having these principles set up and therefore being able to trust the partners and the stakeholders around you, I think that's truly important and absolutely what you should do early stage.
So what you're saying is that it is very important in the very beginning when you form a company to sit down and think through all kinds of scenarios and make a plan. How are you going to, as a team, deal with it?
Yeah, I don't think it's the first thing you do, because that wouldn't make sense. You first need to come up with, like, why are we doing this, and do we like each other, and what kind of competence do we have going into this. But maybe the third or fourth thing you do is to take this dialogue. If you start out with like a rough idea, like we're going to solve this problem, then the second thing is go out and meet the people who supposedly have this problem. Figure out if it's real, how they are describing it, and whether they would be willing to actually invest something in solving it. And then you have something that is like a very early validation, and then it makes sense to actually start talking about, are we going to do this? Are we going to like risk our personal finances? Are we going to spend this time on this? And if we are, what kind of principles do we see going into this?
What do you think is the leading cause of failure?
I think there is a lot of research that has been done, but I also believe that every time you hear that a startup failed because of one thing, it was probably not as simple as that. I think there are always a combination of factors. If the only thing was financing, there's always a fix to finding money or not costing anything. Like you could run a company without almost any costs. But looking at the statistics, I'm not really updated, but from what I remember, lack of funding is one prominent factor. Time to market, which goes well with lack of funding, is also one that you always expect it to go much faster than it does. And then
especially in healthcare, right?
Yes, in particular in healthcare. Yeah, deep learning, and there are other areas as well that takes more time than expected. But the founding team is also often listed as a prominent reason for a company having to fold eventually.
Do you think that it could be that the leadership does not adapt to the changing need of the business?
Yes, leadership team and everyone else, because it's so different to be like the first employee in a company and then be an employee in a company of 20 and then 100 and 1,000 or whatever growth trajectory you're on. So in this kind of company, everyone's role is changing at a quite high pace. For a founder, you need to early on realize that I am starting to build relationships that rely on me and how I act. So it's no longer about you. It's getting more and more about potential customers. When you bring in employees, it's more about the employees than yourself. When you bring in investors, it will be more about their money than your own time invested. So you build these kinds of relationships, but also that people rely on you to do good things with their time, with their money, with their attention. So you need to treat that fairly and with a lot of respect. And it's not about you. I mean, the company is you. You will get a lot of, if it goes well, you will get a lot of credit from different places. But as soon as you start a company, it's no longer about you. If you start an aktiebolag, as it is in Sweden, the company is its own legal entity. So you suddenly have something to take care of, and then it's not you anymore.
I just recently read an interesting article from Harvard Business Review by Linda Hill. It's about becoming the boss. And how do you manage, especially if you do that for the first time, and you all of a sudden you go into the position with a lot of preconceptions, or as she calls them, myths, and then you have to adapt to that leadership role, and it's quite a difficult transition for a lot of people. 50% of them don't know how to ask for help. But the myths she mentioned, for example, managers wield significant authority and freedom to make things happen. But then when you're in the team and you try to make things happen, you quickly realize that you have to be in the middle of a web of relationships with people who make demands on you and have conflicting demands and have conflicting ideas about how you should proceed or how the team should proceed. And then as a leader, you need to grow into the role and figure out how this web of conflicting demands works and channel it in order to bring everybody on the same page.
Yeah, and one thing to think about, it's not necessarily you, because I've met with a lot of founders who didn't really, maybe they didn't expect it, but at least they didn't want it. They had this idea or concept, and maybe they were really good developers or designers or whatever. And as the company grows, they get to do less and less of what they're good at and what they wanted to do from the beginning. So I think when you start hiring other competencies, it's easy to look for functions like I need a developer, or I need a designer, or I need someone who can sell. But as you grow, you also need to look for the softer competencies. Like, do I want to develop into a leader for this organization and become the CEO, for example? Or is it better for me and for this organization if I bring someone in who's good at that? I think, to develop as an individual and go from this expert founder to a leader is, of course, a great trajectory if you want that. But if you know on beforehand that this is not what I want to spend my time with, don't do it.
Yeah, it also came up in a previous episode when we were talking with Finn Kettler, who pointed out that a team, as the company grows, the team will also change according to the current needs of the company in certain stages. And you need to be mindful of those changes and accept them. And accept that sometimes it's not you who's going to be the most effective leader of this company.
Yeah, and also maybe it's not you who will be the most important person in the company. And from what I have seen, I think that's something that is tricky for some founders.
Yeah, it's a difficult self-reflection task and also acceptance task.
Yes. So a lot of work has to go into both the company and yourself. And as a leader, a lot of work has to go into your colleagues as well. And that's why it makes sense to see these kind of jobs as different tasks that has to be done by someone, if not you, someone else.
When I worked in a startup before, through the mentor network we were part of, the founders, they had support for managing their role as leaders in the company. Have you ever seen any sort of support opportunities or used yourself?
I think, one simple example, or one simple solution is to find yourself a mentor. Someone who has been through a similar thing before. They are never like exact the same thing, of course, but similar experiences, and therefore like find a fast track to these experiences, so you don't have to make the mistakes yourself. I also believe a lot of incubators have enough experience from startups who have both succeeded and failed to know what is important to figure out at an early stage, and what kind of leadership challenges arrive at these early stages, or the different stages that you go through. So maybe it could sound like a big thing, but to draft your succession plan at an early stage is not the worst thing. Again, back to what I said before with having the principles as founders. What do we do if or when this happens? Maybe you know that my mission with this company is to run it for 3 years, or until we are 50 people, or until we have reached other certain targets. And to have that in mind already would, at least to me, make it much easier to early on start to look for what is the next solution to this. Like when we need a leader for 60, 100 people, where can I find that person? And to do that as a long-term investment and research task, instead of having to fix another crisis later on.
Yeah, this is a very good advice you can give to our listeners. And now that you're stepping into the role of CEO of Mink, what key learnings can you bring into your work with early stage startups?
I think that the first realization when it was clear that I would get this job was to back to the blind spots. Like, I know I have blind spots in this context. I've run a company at Mink, so I've been part of the community and have had the experience as one company. So the first thing I need to understand is, as for any startup, like, understand the market. What is the actual need? The things I saw, both good and bad, were they like typical for founders in that context, or was it just me? And try to figure out what kind of perspectives matter in this situation. So what I do now is that I meet with a lot of people, both to start with externally, and then meeting with the companies within, meeting with the team, and figure out what kind of experience do we have, like the shared experience we have here, and then see, are there problems that needs fixing? Are there opportunities that we could go for that we haven't tried yet? So there's a lot of learning, both, of course, from having a company in an incubator, that's very specific, but also having started and run companies, both in big contexts and in smaller contexts before. What does it mean to create value for someone? How do you actually create something that is useful and meaningful and worth spending time or money on?
Thank you so much for your honesty and your insights. It's very important to acknowledge that we can learn a lot from failure, and we need to talk more about the processes, the situations that lead towards failure in order to grow and do it better next time. So I would like to encourage our listeners to share their thoughts in a comment under the episode. You can find Walk the Valley on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Tomas, thank you once again for your honesty and insights. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you. If I could add something, maybe we should get rid of failure as a concept. I think failure is what happens when you haven't really tried. So as long as you keep pushing and try new things, the outcome might be bad, but it wasn't really a failure if you didn't make honest mistakes. Not honest mistake, if you didn't make conscious mistakes. As long as you do what you believe is right and push forward, if it turns out bad, it wasn't really a failure. It was for sure a learning, but it was more of an outcome.
So if you're saying that the outcome shouldn't be perceived as or we should get rid of the concept of failure, but then we should get rid of the bad outcome.
Yeah, I think it goes back to this saying in the startup world that you should fail fast. And I think it's terrible, because what it tries to induce in organization is to be faster to shut things down. At least that's the effect that I've seen when I've been working with big organizations. And no one goes up in the morning and thinks, today I'm going to fail, but I'm going to do it really fast. It's not something to strive for. So why should we say that we should fail fast? I think it's much more important to reframe this into fast learnings and iterations. Failure is an outcome when we have tried it all and it didn't work. And then it's not really a failure that is put on you. It's an outcome, even if we tried and did our best. And then the learning is the positive outcome that we should have been striving for all along. And I think we can also see that many founders who have a company that folds in some way or another, maybe they need some rest after that experience and do something else, but they eventually come back into entrepreneurship again and want to try something new. And I think that tells me that it wasn't about learning from failure. It was this constant iteration and trying to push things and make things happen that haven't happened before. And that's 100% constructive and value building, and something that we should design for to happen much more than it does today. So don't fail fast, but learn a lot of things and do a lot of things, and then do them again, but better.
Failing fast sounds like run into the wall, and if you don't break through the wall for the first time, then run into the wall again, and then you just damage yourself in the process.
Yeah, and it's not a good narrative. No, we want to be sustainable while trying.
That's it for today's episode of Walk the Valley. Talking with Tomas was a reminder that startup life isn't just about strategy and metrics. It's also about navigating doubt, pressure, and growth as a person and as a leader. If there's one thing to take away, it's that asking questions early, planning for multiple outcomes, and building trust within your founder team can make all the difference when things get tough. If you found this conversation helpful, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. You can listen to Walk the Valley on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Be sure to subscribe for more stories about the tough but rewarding journey through healthcare innovation. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a review. It makes a big difference. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep walking the valley.